Tonight, prepare to meet a woman who dared to fly in a world determined to keep her grounded. A nurse, a pioneer, and a fighter, Janet Bragg broke through racial and gender barriers when the sky was still off limits for people like her. Denied again and again, she refused to give up. Instead, she soared above prejudice and paved the way for future generations of pilots. This is the remarkable, inspiring story of Janet Bragg, the trailblazer who proved that the sky belongs to everyone. Before we take flight into her incredible journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon, so you'll never miss more powerful stories from history that deserve to be heard. Now let's begin. The story of Janet Harmon Bragg begins in a world that seemed determined to keep her on the ground. She was born on March 24, 1907, in Griffin, Georgia, a small southern town steeped in tradition and shadowed by segregation. Her family was large, hardworking, and proud. Janet was the seventh child, born into a lineage woven from African, Cherokee, and even Spanish ancestry. Her father, Samuel, earned his living as a brick contractor, while her mother, Cordia, taught her children the value of perseverance and ambition in a world that often gave them few chances. Janet's early childhood reflected both the warmth of family life and the cold realities of the American South. Schools for black children were underfunded and overlooked, but her parents were determined to give their daughter more. She attended St. Stephen's Episcopal School and later Fort Valley Episcopal High School, schools that, while modest, nurtured young minds with care and discipline. Within their walls, Janet's natural curiosity thrived. Even as a child, Janet was captivated by the skies. She would spend hours watching birds soar effortlessly above, wondering what it would be like to join them. But in those early days, aviation was a distant dream, reserved for white men and beyond the reach of young black girls from Georgia. As she grew, Janet's ambitions stretched far beyond the cotton fields and dusty roads of her hometown. Determined to make something of herself, she pursued nursing, one of the few respectable careers open to black women at the time. She enrolled at Spelman Seminary in Atlanta, one of the nation's leading institutions for black women. There, she endured the rigors of medical training. Her program was demanding, days and nights spent assisting in surgeries and procedures normally reserved for interns. Only 2 students out of 12 completed the intense training. Janet was one of them. By 1929, she emerged as a qualified registered nurse. She returned to Griffin for a brief period to serve at the local hospital, but the weight of the Great Depression crushed opportunities across the South. Jobs were scarce, and the future seemed uncertain. Refusing to settle for less, Janet packed her bags and left for Rockford, Illinois, where one of her sisters lived. There, she passed the state's nursing exam but still faced rejection after rejection for jobs. The North, it seemed, had its own subtle forms of discrimination. Eventually, she moved to Chicago, where life began to shift. Janet secured a nursing job at Wilson Hospital. The big city offered new energy, and more importantly, new possibilities. It was in Chicago that fate intervened. One evening, while walking home from work, she noticed a billboard that would change her life forever. It boldly asked, "Birds can fly, why can't you?" Those words reignited the passion that had stirred in her childhood. The dream of flight, once pushed aside, came rushing back. Without hesitation, Janet enrolled in evening aviation classes at Aeronautical University. She was the only woman, and the only black woman, in a class of 24 black men. Her presence alone challenged norms. Her courage and determination, however, earned her classmates' respect. Flight training was expensive, and few could afford to complete the required hours. Janet, who earned a steady nurse's salary, used her own money to invest in a training plane for the school. Not only did this help her advance her own training, but it made flight possible for her peers as well. She even helped build the school's first airfield in Robbins, Illinois, the first black-owned and operated airport in the United States. At every turn, Janet Bragg refused to accept the limits imposed upon her by society. The sky was calling, and she intended to answer. But as she would soon discover, reaching the clouds would require more than skill. It would demand resilience, grit, and the strength to face down prejudice head-on. By the early 1930s, Chicago had become Janet Bragg's new home, a city buzzing with life, hope, and ambition. But even in this energetic metropolis, the road to the sky was far from smooth. Despite gaining admission to Aeronautical University, Janet faced subtle and overt obstacles. She was a black woman in a space that was almost entirely reserved for white men. Some classmates initially doubted her. Some instructors, though professional, couldn't hide their biases. Still, Janet remained undeterred. Her evenings were spent in classrooms filled with diagrams and theory, while weekends were reserved for actual flying. The roar of engines, the rush of air, and the view from above, these became her world. Janet relished every moment behind the controls. Each lesson brought her closer to the dream that had once seemed so distant. Her determination soon paid off. By 1934, she earned her private pilot's license, a rare accomplishment for anyone at the time, and even more so for a black woman. But Janet wasn't content to stop there. Her ambitions soared higher. She yearned to become a commercial pilot, a professional aviator who could inspire others and shatter the limitations imposed by society. However, dreams do not always align with reality. Time and again, Janet faced rejection. No commercial aviation program would accept her. Airlines refused to even consider her applications. Her gender was a strike against her, and her race sealed the verdict in the minds of many decision-makers. For them, a black woman in the cockpit was simply unimaginable. But Janet was not the type to back down. Rather than accept the doors that were closed, she looked for other ways to carve her path. She continued flying privately and began advocating for other black pilots. She poured her energy into organizations that promoted black aviators, many of whom faced the same frustrations she did. Through networking and support, Janet helped build a tight-knit community determined to break aviation's color and gender barriers. Her commitment went beyond personal ambition. She supported the National Airmen's Association of America, NA, which worked tirelessly to promote black participation in aviation. Through this group, Janet connected with pioneers who shared her vision. Together, they fought for equal access to training, recognition, and opportunity. Even as she pushed forward, the world around her began to shift. The winds of war were stirring across Europe, and soon, the United States would be drawn into the conflict. The aviation industry, once resistant to diversification, would be forced to reconsider who could contribute to the nation's defense. Janet saw a new opportunity. In the early 1940s, she applied to enter the Civilian Pilot Training Program, CPTP, which had begun to accept black students due to pressure from civil rights groups and the growing need for pilots. She was accepted, and her skills quickly placed her among the best trainees. However, when she applied to become a military pilot, another wall rose before her. Despite her qualifications, the military rejected her. Race and gender were, once again, the excuses used to deny her. But Janet refused to let bitterness take hold. Instead, she returned to civilian aviation, focusing on her mission to inspire and educate. By this time, Janet had become a respected figure within Chicago's aviation circles. She continued flying, mentoring young black pilots, and speaking publicly about the need for inclusion in the skies. For Janet, flying was more than a personal passion, it had become a powerful form of resistance. Though the path had been steep and riddled with roadblocks, Janet Bragg had now firmly established herself as one of the most dedicated and skilled black female aviators in the nation. Still, she knew her journey was far from over. Ahead, war would change everything, and present her with a new set of battles. As the 1940s dawned, the world teetered on the brink of chaos. War raged across Europe and Asia, and soon, the United States would be drawn into the conflict. For Janet Bragg, the coming war seemed like more than just a global crisis. It felt like a new opportunity to prove herself, to serve her country in the skies, and to finally be recognized as a professional pilot. By this time, Janet had already made a name for herself in Chicago's tight-knit aviation circles. She had her private pilot's license, hundreds of flying hours, and deep involvement in the National Airmen's Association of America. But she wanted more. She wanted to do what so many others would be asked to do: fly for the military. Her first attempt came when she applied to join the U.S. Army Air Corps. She met the qualifications. Her skills were undeniable. But the answer came quickly and coldly: rejected. There were no positions available for black women pilots, they said. The military at that time, still deeply segregated, saw no place for someone like Janet in its ranks. It was a painful blow. Janet had worked tirelessly to reach this point, believing that service and skill might outweigh prejudice. But the barriers were not merely professional, they were deeply personal, woven into the fabric of the nation itself. Still, Janet did not stop. When the famed Tuskegee Airmen program began, opening the door to black men who wanted to fly for the military, Janet saw another chance. She applied and, incredibly, was accepted into the Tuskegee Institute's Advanced Pilot Training Program. It was a historic moment. She became the only woman in a class full of determined black men aiming to prove their worth as military pilots. At Tuskegee, she pushed herself harder than ever. The training was rigorous and grueling. Every day was a test of not just skill, but of spirit. The instructors were demanding, and the expectations were sky high. Still, Janet excelled. She flew flawlessly, passed every test, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the men around her. In the cockpit, she was as good as anyone, perhaps better. But once again, prejudice reared its head. When it came time to receive her military pilot's license, the ultimate validation of her skills, she was denied. The official reason was vague, wrapped in bureaucratic language. The truth was simpler and crueler: she was a black woman, and that was enough for them to refuse her. The rejection hit hard. Janet had done everything right. She had proven herself repeatedly. Yet she was still being judged not for what she could do, but for who she was. Rather than retreat in bitterness, Janet found strength in defiance. She returned to Chicago, recommitted to civilian aviation and to breaking down barriers for those who would follow her. She flew whenever and wherever she could. She taught others, especially young black men and women hungry for the freedom of the skies. She gave lectures and participated in advocacy, using her voice to fight the very forces that kept her grounded. Janet's struggle to serve her country as a military pilot was never officially recognized during the war. But in the hearts and minds of those she inspired, she had become something more than a pilot. She had become a symbol, proof that talent, drive, and courage could exist in places society refused to look. The war years were frustrating and painful, but they also sharpened Janet's resolve. She understood now that her mission was about more than personal ambition. It was about opening doors that others would walk through long after she was gone. Ahead, her greatest contributions were yet to come, and Janet Bragg was ready. The war eventually came to an end, leaving behind a changed world. Soldiers returned home, cities rebuilt, and industries flourished in the post-war boom. But for Janet Bragg, little had changed where it mattered most. She was still a black woman in an aviation world that remained stubbornly closed to her. The dream of flying commercially or as a military pilot had not materialized. Yet Janet was not defeated. She never had been. Returning to Chicago after Tuskegee, she refocused her life with the same determination that had guided her through the darkest of disappointments. Though the nation celebrated victory, discrimination still ruled the skies. Commercial airlines were booming, but they had no interest in diversifying their cockpits. Women, and certainly black women, were simply not considered. Janet understood that she would have to adjust her course. If she couldn't serve as a commercial or military pilot, she would find another way to make aviation a central part of her life. She doubled down on her involvement in aviation advocacy and education. She became a mentor to young black pilots, especially veterans returning from the war who had flown in segregated units. Many of them looked to Janet as a source of guidance, someone who had weathered the same storms they were now facing. Meanwhile, her career in nursing continued steadily. Janet knew how to balance her responsibilities. By day, she served the community as a dedicated nurse. By night and on weekends, she continued to fly and teach. To her, both vocations were about care, caring for people and caring for dreams. But flying wasn't enough anymore. Janet wanted to push for broader change, to create spaces where Black aviators could thrive and be recognized. In this spirit, she became deeply involved with the National Airmen's Association of America. The organization, which had grown significantly since the 1930s, was committed to fighting for Black representation in aviation. Janet took on leadership roles, tirelessly working to connect pilots, organize events, and advocate for policy changes. Her reputation grew far beyond Chicago. Across the country, Janet became known as a pioneer, not only because of her personal achievements, but because of how selflessly she championed others. While many quietly accepted the barriers placed before them, Janet's voice rang loud and clear. She believed that one day, Black men and women would have the same right to soar as anyone else. In the mid-1940s and 1950s, the civil rights movement began to gather momentum. Janet saw her mission as part of that larger struggle. Equality in the skies, she believed, was inseparable from equality on the ground. Whenever she spoke publicly, whether at aviation clubs, schools, or political gatherings, she linked the freedom of flight to the broader fight for justice. During these years, Janet also faced personal decisions. While aviation had consumed much of her adult life, she remained deeply connected to her family and friends. She met and later married Sumner Bragg, a businessman and supporter of her dreams. The marriage was not only a partnership of love but also of mutual respect and shared ambition. With Sumner by her side, Janet expanded her horizons further. Together, they traveled extensively, often flying themselves to destinations across North and Central America. These journeys were not about proving anything anymore. They were about enjoying the freedom she had fought so hard to claim. Still, even as she lived this personal joy, Janet never abandoned her role as a trailblazer. She remained committed to teaching, mentoring, and building opportunities for others. Flying had become more than her dream. It had become her legacy. But there was still one title that eluded her: the commercial pilot's license. Though years had passed since the war, and though progress had been made, old prejudices still lingered. And yet, Janet wasn't finished. Ahead, her story would take one final, triumphant turn, one that would secure her place in aviation history. By the early 1950s, Janet Bragg had already achieved what many thought impossible. She had become a respected aviator, a mentor, a leader in aviation advocacy, and an inspiration to countless young Black pilots. But there remained one goal she had yet to reach, one that had haunted her for years. Janet still did not have her commercial pilot's license. This was not from lack of skill or experience. She had logged hundreds of flight hours. She had flown in weather conditions that would rattle even the most seasoned pilots. She had trained, taught, and even helped build an airfield. Still, systemic racism and sexism had stood in her way time and time again. Commercial licenses were a golden ticket, a formal recognition that one was a professional pilot, fit to carry passengers or cargo, and capable of earning a living from flying. And Janet wanted that recognition, not just for herself, but for what it would symbolize. Determined to overcome the final hurdle, she searched for a place that would judge her solely on her abilities. That search took her far from Chicago, and even farther from the segregated skies of the United States. Janet set her sights on a country known for being more progressive when it came to race and gender, Canada. In 1943, she traveled north to take her commercial pilot's examination. It was a bold move, but one born from necessity. In the United States, every door had been closed. In Canada, there was at least the possibility of fairness. The experience was markedly different. The instructors and examiners in Canada treated her like any other student. They cared about her flight skills, her navigation, her communication, and her ability to handle pressure, not about the color of her skin or her gender. Janet excelled. She completed every requirement with confidence and precision. Her training, her countless hours in the air, and her resilience shone through. When the test was over, she received the news she had longed to hear for years. She had passed. She was now, officially, a licensed commercial pilot. It was a quiet victory in many ways. There were no parades, no front-page headlines, and no instant fame. But for Janet, it was everything. She had shattered yet another barrier, and reached a goal that had seemed impossible for so long. In her own mind, and in the eyes of all who knew her, she was a pioneer who had rewritten the rules of what black women could achieve. Returning to Chicago, Janet did not rush to join airlines, which remained resistant to hiring women and people of color. Instead, she continued flying privately and using her commercial license to mentor and inspire others. She flew medical supplies, transported goods, and even ferried friends and family across states. More importantly, she carried herself as a symbol of what could be done when one refuses to be grounded. Her commercial license validated everything she stood for. It proved that black women were every bit as capable as anyone else in the cockpit. It proved that, with determination, even the most rigid walls could be broken down. And it proved that dreams deferred are not dreams denied. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Janet continued to fly and to lead. She remained active in aviation circles, continued her work in nursing, and became a beloved figure in her community. When people spoke of her, they didn't just speak of her as a nurse or a pilot. They spoke of her as a trailblazer. But even as she savored this milestone, Janet knew her work was not finished. The fight for equality in aviation, and in America, was still raging. Ahead of her was another mission: to make sure that the next generation could reach the skies without having to endure the same struggles she had faced. By the time Janet Bragg earned her commercial pilot's license, she had already spent decades pushing back against barriers that others thought unbreakable. The license was her personal triumph, but Janet saw it as more than that. To her, it was a torch she could now carry for others, lighting the way forward for a new generation of black pilots and aspiring aviators who had always been told they didn't belong in the sky. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, change was sweeping across America. The civil rights movement had grown into a powerful force. Activists marched, protested, and risked everything to dismantle systemic racism and demand justice. Though Janet's battles were fought largely in the skies, she understood that they were connected to the broader fight on the ground. In her hometown of Chicago, Janet became an even stronger voice for equality in aviation. She continued to work closely with the National Airmen's Association of America, an organization she had long supported and helped lead. Through the association, she mentored young black men and women eager to follow in her footsteps. She taught them about flight, about determination, and about resilience. Mentorship became her new mission. Janet opened doors where others had found only walls. She guided students through their training, helped them prepare for exams, and gave them the confidence they needed to confront discrimination head-on. To her, every student who earned their wings was a victory against the ignorance and prejudice she had fought her whole life. Janet also understood that representation mattered deeply. She made sure to be visible, attending aviation events, speaking at schools and conferences, and participating in community initiatives. In a world where black female pilots were still rare, her presence sent a powerful message: you can do this, too. In these years, Janet was more than just a mentor. She became a living legend in Chicago's black community. Her achievements were celebrated, and her story passed along from one generation to the next. Yet, she remained remarkably humble. For Janet, flying had always been about freedom and passion, not fame. Even though commercial airlines still largely resisted diversifying their cockpits, Janet's work helped spark a slow but inevitable change. The growing civil rights movement began to influence hiring policies, and little by little, black pilots began entering major airlines. Janet took great pride in seeing the doors she helped push open finally swing wider. Meanwhile, in her personal life, she continued to enjoy the fruits of her labor. Together with her husband Sumner Bragg, Janet traveled extensively, often piloting her own plane. These trips were not about making statements or breaking records. They were about joy, about experiencing the simple, extraordinary thrill of flight that had first captivated her as a child watching birds in the Georgia sky. Though she slowed down a bit in the later years of her life, Janet never completely stepped away from aviation. She flew well into her 60s, always eager to climb into the cockpit and feel the familiar rush of takeoff. Even when grounded, she was deeply involved in aviation circles, often serving as an honored guest or speaker. Janet Bragg's later years were marked not by bitterness about the struggles she had endured, but by a quiet satisfaction in how far she, and the world, had come. She had fought, she had flown, and she had helped others take flight. Her legacy was alive in every young black pilot who earned their wings and in every woman who refused to accept that some dreams were out of reach. But recognition from the broader public and the aviation industry itself was still slow to come. Janet knew her story was important, and eventually, she took steps to make sure it would not be forgotten. Ahead, she would reflect on her remarkable journey, and ensure her voice would echo long after her final landing. As the decades passed, Janet Bragg watched the world change around her. When she had taken her first flying lessons, she was seen as an anomaly, a black woman daring to dream of the skies in a time when the cockpit was all but forbidden to her. Now, she witnessed the slow but steady shift. Commercial airlines began hiring black pilots. Women were becoming more visible in aviation, and barriers she once smashed through alone were being dismantled by collective effort. Still, too many people didn't know how hard the journey had been. Janet understood better than anyone that history had a way of forgetting people like her. Pioneers who were quietly resilient, who fought behind the scenes, and who didn't seek headlines were often overlooked. Determined that her story, and the stories of those like her, would not fade into obscurity, she made a decision. She would preserve her legacy in her own words. In her later years, Janet Bragg began work on a memoir. She partnered with Marjorie Chris, a writer who understood the importance of sharing Janet's voice authentically and powerfully. Together, they crafted Soaring Above Setbacks, a memoir that was as much about determination and courage as it was about flying. The process of writing forced Janet to revisit both the triumphs and the painful memories. She recounted the sting of rejection, the frustration of exclusion, and the quiet, persistent racism she faced in nearly every corner of aviation. But she also celebrated the victories, earning her commercial license in Canada, helping build the first black-owned airfield in Robbins, Illinois, mentoring dozens of black pilots who would go on to successful careers, and never once giving up on her dream. The memoir was more than a collection of personal stories. It was a testament to the unyielding human spirit. Through its pages, readers were able to see the world as Janet had seen it, both the beauty of flight and the ugliness of discrimination. Her words resonated with aspiring pilots, historians, civil rights activists, and ordinary readers alike. While the memoir helped solidify her legacy on paper, recognition from the aviation community and wider society followed more slowly. By the 1980s and 1990s, Janet had become a respected elder stateswoman of aviation. Aviation groups began to honor her contributions, inviting her to speak at events and present awards. Young pilots approached her with admiration, often telling her that they stood where they did because of her sacrifices. Despite the accolades, Janet remained humble. For her, the true reward had always been helping others rise. She was most proud when former students, some of whom had gone on to fly for major airlines or even military jets, reached out to thank her for the example she had set. She was, in many ways, a quiet revolutionary. Beyond aviation, Janet was also embraced by her local community. In Chicago, she was celebrated as a pioneering nurse, a beloved mentor, and a woman who had never forgotten where she came from. Her life embodied the idea that service to others was the highest form of achievement. As she grew older, Janet remained active and sharp. She continued attending aviation events, kept in touch with her network of pilots and ments, and never lost her love of flying. Though age eventually grounded her physically, her spirit remained airborne. Janet Bragg's memoir became a symbol, not only of her personal legacy but of an entire generation's struggle and progress. She had preserved her story in her own words so that future generations could understand just how high determination and courage could carry them. But her story was not yet finished. Even as she aged gracefully, Janet's impact was still unfolding, and the honors that had once eluded her were finally beginning to arrive. For much of her life, Janet Bragg had soared above prejudice and setbacks with little public recognition. Her victories were personal and often private. She had inspired individuals, shaped communities, and broken barriers without headlines or awards. But as the years progressed and society began to re-examine its past, a shift occurred. At long last, the world began to acknowledge what she had done. The 1980s and 1990s brought long overdue appreciation for the quiet pioneers of civil rights and aviation. Janet, now in her senior years, found herself invited to events not just as a guest, but as a guest of honor. Organizations that once overlooked people like her now sought her presence. She was asked to speak about her experiences, to share wisdom with younger generations, and to receive awards that symbolized much more than personal achievement. At aviation conferences, Janet was often introduced with reverence. People stood to applaud the woman who had been the only female in an all-male flying class, the only black student in rooms of exclusion, and the only woman who had the audacity to buy her own airplane to make sure she and others could keep learning. In those moments, the years of rejection seemed to melt away. Schools, community groups, and black aviation organizations began telling her story more widely. She became an icon not only to aspiring aviators but also to historians of civil rights. Though her battles had been fought largely in the realm of aviation, her courage and resilience echoed the larger narrative of black Americans fighting for equality across every sector of society. One of her most significant honors came in the form of institutional recognition. Museums, aviation societies, and historical archives began to include her in exhibits and educational materials. No longer was Janet Bragg a footnote in history. She was becoming part of the story told to inspire future generations. Students from around the country wrote to her. Some were young black girls dreaming of becoming pilots. Others were aviation enthusiasts who saw her as a symbol of what perseverance could achieve. Each letter was a reminder that her impact extended far beyond the cockpit. Janet took it all in with her trademark humility. She often smiled at ceremonies but made sure to redirect the spotlight. To her, the work had never been about personal glory. It had always been about creating opportunities for those who would come after her. Her advocacy remained sharp even in these golden years. She continued to speak openly about the need for diversity in aviation. She supported scholarships for young pilots from underserved communities. She championed women in flight, encouraging them to push beyond artificial limits. The most profound recognition, however, came not from medals or speeches but from what she saw every day: a new generation of black men and women confidently pursuing careers in aviation. Some flew commercial jets. Others served in the military. Still others became instructors, passing along knowledge just as Janet had done decades earlier. In these moments, she saw her mission fulfilled. The barriers she had faced had not disappeared completely, but they had cracked and crumbled in the face of steady, determined resistance. She had been one of the first to push against them, and now countless others followed through the spaces she helped create. By the mid-1990s, Janet Bragg was widely celebrated as a pioneer. Yet, despite the honors, she remained grounded, not in body, but in spirit. She still saw herself simply as a woman who had loved to fly and who refused to give up. As the century drew to a close, Janet Bragg prepared to take her final bow. Her health began to decline, but even then, she faced life's closing chapter with the same grace and dignity she had shown all along. The time had come to pass the torch for good. But before she left, the world would come together one last time to say thank you, to honor a life spent fighting gravity in more ways than one. As the 20th century drew to a close, Janet Bragg entered the twilight of her remarkable life. By now, her story was no longer hidden in the shadows. The aviation community knew her name. Civil rights advocates spoke of her courage. Young pilots, especially women and people of color, viewed her as a beacon, proof that the impossible could be made possible with determination and grit. Her days of soaring through the skies were behind her, but Janet's impact was far from grounded. Though age had slowed her body, her mind remained sharp and her spirit unbroken. She continued to receive letters, invitations to speak, and heartfelt thanks from those whose lives she had touched. She relished these connections, always eager to offer encouragement and wisdom. Janet's home became a sort of informal headquarters for mentorship and reflection. Friends, former students, and admirers visited often, eager to hear firsthand about her experiences. She shared stories from her early days: the loneliness of being the only woman in flight school, the frustration of being denied a military pilot's license, and the triumph of earning her commercial license in Canada. She spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity and grace. These were not tales of defeat, but lessons in resilience. Even as she grew more frail, Janet's commitment to aviation and to her community never wavered. She stayed involved with various pilot associations and civic groups, often offering guidance and lending her name to causes that promoted inclusion and diversity in aviation. She celebrated the successes of others as much as, if not more than, her own. Janet's personal life remained full as well. Her husband, Sumner, had always been a steady presence. Together, they had built a life marked by adventure, service, and quiet joy. Though Janet was increasingly celebrated as a public figure, she always cherished the private moments, evenings spent with family, quiet flights in earlier years, and peaceful mornings reflecting on how far she had come. In 1993, the aviation world mourned as Janet Bragg passed away at the age of 86. The news of her death spread quickly, and tributes poured in from across the country. Aviation clubs, civil rights organizations, and former students honored her memory. To many, her passing marked the end of an era, but it also served as a reminder of how far things had progressed because of people like her. In memorials and obituaries, she was remembered not just as a pilot, but as a trailblazer who had carved a path through prejudice and made the sky accessible to many who had once been told to keep their feet firmly on the ground. She had fought 2 battles in her life, one against gravity, and another against discrimination. She had won them both. Perhaps most moving were the stories shared by those who had flown because of her. Pilots, especially black men and women who had entered commercial aviation, military service, or aeronautical engineering, spoke openly about Janet's influence. She had made their dreams attainable. She had been the proof that race and gender could not and should not define who had the right to fly. Her legacy was further cemented when her memoir, Soaring Above Setbacks, continued to circulate among aspiring pilots and students of history. Through her own words, Janet remained a teacher and a mentor even in death. Her voice, calm, steady, and sure, echoed through the pages, carrying her story into classrooms, libraries, and aviation museums. Even decades after her passing, her name is spoken with reverence. Exhibits about African American aviators always include her face. Discussions of women's contributions to flight highlight her tenacity. In every airplane cockpit where diversity now thrives, Janet Bragg's spirit quietly rides along. Her final landing may have come in 1993, but in truth, Janet Bragg never stopped flying. She became part of the air itself, woven into the dreams of all those who dared to look up and believe they belong among the clouds. Even after Janet Bragg's passing in 1993, her presence has never truly left the world of aviation. Her story, once whispered quietly among aspiring black pilots and women determined to fly, has become part of the very foundation on which modern aviation stands. She is no longer just a pioneering figure in a segregated nation's past. She is a symbol, a permanent fixture in the pantheon of those who made the sky a place for everyone. In the years following her death, recognition of her contributions only continued to grow. Aviation museums across the United States began including her story in their exhibits on African American pilots and women in aviation. The Smithsonian Institution, as well as local aviation halls of fame, paid tribute to the path she paved. Young visitors now read about her struggles and triumphs, often seeing themselves reflected in her journey. In those moments, Janet Bragg becomes not a distant historical figure, but a source of personal inspiration. For educators and historians, her story offers something rare, a bridge between movements. She stood at the crossroads of gender and race, fighting twin battles in a world that tried to deny her worth on both counts. Her life is now studied not only in aviation circles but also in civil rights curricula and women's history courses. To students, she embodies the lesson that change often comes quietly, through persistence and daily courage, rather than through sudden, sweeping revolutions. Her influence extends even further through the countless pilots she mentored directly and indirectly. Many who fly today do so without facing the same barriers she once encountered, yet they know it is only because of people like Janet. They speak her name with gratitude, a nod to the woman who made it easier for them to sit in the captain's seat, to navigate the skies freely and proudly. Organizations continue to honor her legacy. Scholarships bearing her name have been established to help young pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. Aviation groups hold annual lectures and awards ceremonies where Janet's story is shared, ensuring that new generations of flyers understand the road once traveled to make the skies truly inclusive. Her impact has even extended to programs encouraging young girls, especially girls of color, to consider careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, fields where women have historically been underrepresented. But perhaps the most profound legacy of all is less tangible, yet unmistakable. It lives in the quiet confidence of the young woman climbing into a flight simulator, the proud smile of a black pilot preparing for takeoff, or the quiet sense of belonging in any aviation space that once would have felt hostile or unreachable. Janet's life work made all of these moments possible. In photos and records, she appears forever in her crisp pilot's uniform, eyes bright, posture steady, the very image of resolve. But her true portrait is painted in the lives she touched and the pathways she cleared. Every time a young pilot takes to the sky without questioning their right to be there, Janet Bragg flies once more. She taught the world that flying is not only about skill or daring. It is about freedom. Freedom to chase dreams. Freedom to defy expectations. Freedom to rise above prejudice and small-mindedness. In teaching us that lesson, Janet Bragg left a legacy that is timeless and boundless, like the sky itself. Her story closes here, yet it continues every day, carried by wings that now belong to all. Janet Bragg proved that no barrier is too strong when dreams take flight. Her courage opened skies once closed to so many. If her story inspired you, like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Join us next time for more true stories that shaped history. Until then, keep dreaming, and keep reaching higher.